"What's the matter, soldier? Lose your pride with your boots." The man in the tailored suit spat in Eddie's hand, grinning as he turned his back without a care in the world. Eddie didn't move. He didn't flinch, but the city froze when a shadow stepped off the curb. Calm, quiet. Sylvester Stallone. The man stopped mid-step, his grin fading as the street held its breath. What Stallone said next, it left the entire block in stunned silence. "Welcome to Stalone Unleashed. Let's uncover what really happened." The street corner was a place of hustle, where the world passed by with little care for the souls stationed on the edges, invisible to most. Old bricks from the buildings nearby, cracked and weathered by time, cast shadows on the sidewalk as traffic rumbled past. It was here, near the corner of Elm and Fifth, that Eddie sat. Once a man with dreams, once a soldier, but now he was just a figure in worn clothes and a grizzled beard, his eyes watching the world move on without him. His cardboard sign, scribbled in faded marker, read "Veteran. Anything helps." It had been a long morning, the sun beating down mercilessly. The air smelled of exhaust, coffee, and cheap perfumes, but Eddie didn't mind. He had learned long ago that the smell of the streets was far easier to handle than the weight of the memories he carried. He glanced down at his hands, rough and calloused from years of work, but there was nothing left to do now but wait, sit, and hope for a few coins or a kind word. A man in a tailored suit strode by, his steps sharp and determined. Eddie looked up, his eyes tracing the man's silhouette, but didn't expect him to stop. He never did. But today, something different happened. As the suited man walked past, he spat directly onto Eddie's outstretched palm. The action was quick, a flash of disdain, as if Eddie was nothing more than an obstacle to avoid. The crowd around them seemed to freeze for a moment, but then quickly resumed their pace, pretending nothing had happened. Eddie sat there, stunned. The spit slowly dripped down his hand, a symbol of the disrespect he had felt for so long. No words, just a moment of cruelty. He wiped it off, the sting of the humiliation sharp. But as he turned his head, a familiar face caught his eye. Sylvester Stallone, in his usual quiet yet commanding way, had been standing on the corner, watching the entire scene unfold. The veteran's gaze met Stallone's, and for the first time in a long while, Eddie felt something stir deep inside him. The world seemed to blur around Eddie as the spit dried on his hand, the sting of disrespect sinking deeper with each passing second. His eyes remained fixed on the slick smear on his palm, the small, revolting gesture that shattered the fragile peace he had found in his years of solitude. The man had walked away without a second glance, without a thought for the human being he had just humiliated. The sound of the city resumed, cars honking, footsteps pounding, the hum of the crowd. But to Eddie, it felt distant, muffled. The anger came slowly, like a storm brewing on the horizon. His jaw tightened, his fists clenched involuntarily, but he stayed seated, not wanting to give the man any more of a reaction. He had learned long ago that showing anger was a sign of weakness in this world, weakness that people like the man in the suit could exploit. But it didn't change the fact that Eddie had just been reduced to something lower than human in that brief exchange. He looked around, but no one seemed to care. Pedestrians walked past, avoiding eye contact, some even quickening their pace as if the moment had never happened. Eddie's chest tightened. He had fought for this country, bled for it, given years of his life. And now he was here, on this corner, invisible to the very people who had once called him a hero. They had forgotten. Or worse, they never cared. The weight of it all bore down on him, and for the first time in months, Eddie felt a familiar old fire spark inside him. His mind raced with memories of battlefields, of standing tall beside men he trusted, men who had his back. And yet here he was, a man who had given everything, forgotten and disrespected by those who walked by. But then, the unexpected happened. From the corner of his eye, Eddie noticed a shadow standing over him. He didn't need to look up to know who it was. The man had seen it, had witnessed the entire act of cruelty. And now, he was stepping forward. It was Sylvester Stallone, walking toward him with that unmistakable presence, the kind that demanded attention. Eddie's heart skipped a beat. Eddie had learned to endure in silence. The years on the streets had forced him into a life of quiet suffering, where every day blended into the next with a sense of resignation. He had never been one to ask for help, never been one to raise his voice or seek sympathy. That was not his way. Even when the nights grew cold and the hunger gnawed at him like a constant companion, he stayed silent, as if speaking about his pain would make it real. Instead, he wore his suffering like a second skin, hiding it behind a facade of stoic indifference. His days were spent observing, watching the world rush by. He saw people pass him by on the sidewalks, their lives full of purpose, their eyes often avoiding his. He saw children with their heads held high, unaware of the struggles that some faced, unaware of the cost of the freedom they took for granted. He saw businessmen in sharp suits and women in high heels, their lives unmarked by the harsh realities of the streets. Eddie knew what they thought of him, knew they saw him as a stain on their pristine world. A homeless veteran, a man whose usefulness had expired, left to rot in the shadows. But what they didn't know was that he had fought. He had bled for this country, stood side by side with men and women who shared the same mission, the same purpose. They had trusted him, depended on him. He had once been someone of worth, someone who had made a difference. But now none of that mattered. His service was forgotten, his sacrifices erased. All that was left was the cold concrete beneath his feet, the same streets that he had walked for years, unnoticed and unloved. Eddie's eyes drifted to the corner of the street, watching as the world moved on without him. He knew this was his place now, forgotten, discarded. The weight of it settled deep in his chest, but he remained silent. What was the point of speaking? Who would listen to a man like him? The only sounds he heard were the distant voices of the world, the ones that never acknowledged his existence. The man in the tailored suit was a sharp contrast to everything Eddie had come to expect on the streets. His polished shoes clicked against the pavement, the sound of authority, of privilege. He walked with a certain arrogance, as if the world belonged to him. He was well-groomed, his suit a dark, expensive cut that could have cost more than Eddie made in a month of odd jobs. His expression was set, focused, oblivious to the world around him. He walked like a man who believed he was untouchable, his every step reinforcing his sense of superiority. Eddie watched him approach, the figure moving like a predator through the crowd. People stepped aside instinctively, parting before him as if acknowledging his elevated status. They didn't look at him, didn't question him, just moved out of the way. Eddie didn't need to look twice to know the man wouldn't stop. People like him never did. They never saw the veterans on the street, the ones whose bodies and minds had been broken by the wars they fought. To them, those like Eddie were invisible, nothing more than an inconvenience. As the man passed by Eddie's corner, Eddie braced himself. He had seen it all before. The dismissive glances, the ignored pleas, the condescending nods from strangers who couldn't be bothered to acknowledge his existence. But this time was different. The man's pace slowed as he neared Eddie. For a brief moment, their eyes met. The man's gaze was indifferent, cold. He didn't see Eddie as a person, just another shadow on the sidewalk. Without hesitation, without a second thought, the man did something that made Eddie's blood boil. He spat on the ground, right near Eddie's feet, a crude and deliberate act. It wasn't enough to simply ignore Eddie. This man wanted to assert his dominance, to mark his territory in the most degrading way possible. Eddie's heart clenched. The spit was just a symbol, a reflection of the disdain he had felt for so long, but it stung like a slap to the face. He could feel the contempt seeping through every inch of his body, but he remained silent, a quiet rage building inside. The man didn't care, and that was the worst part of it all. Eddie sat still, the humiliation lingering on his skin like the spit that still stained the ground. His gaze was fixed downward, as if somehow focusing on the cracked sidewalk could shield him from the sting of the moment. Around him, life continued as if nothing had happened. People walked by, absorbed in their own worlds, unaware of the quiet injustice unfolding on the corner. There was no one to step in, no one to say anything. The crowd had become an ocean, indifferent to the ripples created by one man's cruelty. It was the way it had always been. The heroes, the ones who truly mattered, were often the ones left unnoticed. They weren't the loud, showy figures making grand gestures on TV screens. They were the ones in the background, the ones who kept their heads down, who had bled and sacrificed without expecting recognition. Eddie had given his service, his youth, and his life to this country. Yet here he was, forgotten, shunted aside, spat on by a man who would never understand the weight of his actions. But as Eddie sat there, fighting to keep his composure, something unexpected shifted in the air. From across the street, a subtle movement caught his eye. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Sylvester Stallone. Eddie's heart skipped a beat. Stallone, the very man who had captured the imaginations of millions through films of grit, honor, and strength. Here, in this chaotic moment, he wasn't a superstar. He was something else, something more human. Stallone didn't speak or make a dramatic entrance. He didn't need to. His presence alone commanded attention. It wasn't just his fame, it was his ability to see beyond the surface, to recognize the value in the people others overlooked. Eddie hadn't known it, but in that brief moment, he had been seen. He wasn't just a homeless veteran forgotten by the world. He wasn't invisible. Someone had noticed. Stallone approached with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen enough in his lifetime to know what real strength looked like. He didn't need words to convey his respect. His actions were all that was necessary. In this chaotic, unforgiving world, Eddie was no longer alone. Eddie didn't know how long he had been sitting there when he first noticed him, but it was as if the world around him slowed when Stallone stepped into his line of sight. The actor, the icon, the one who had graced screens for decades with performances that had become synonymous with strength, determination, and resilience. He was standing across the street, his dark sunglasses catching the light. His presence wasn't loud or commanding in the way one might expect from a celebrity. Rather, it was the subtle way he carried himself, the steady calm in his posture, that made Eddie's heart race. For a moment, Eddie wondered if he was imagining it. Was it just another passing celebrity, one who lived in a bubble far removed from the world Eddie had come to know? But no, this wasn't just another passerby. There was something in the way Stallone's gaze seemed to sweep across the crowd, taking in the scene with an intensity that didn't ignore the small, often overlooked details. Eddie sat still, unsure of what to do. He had no reason to believe someone like Stallone would care, but there was something in the way he lingered that told Eddie otherwise. He wasn't just passing through. The street noise, the usual hum of traffic, faded into the background as Eddie watched Stallone walk towards him. There were no cameras, no entourage, no fans surrounding him asking for autographs or selfies. He was alone, focused on the street in a way that felt different, purposeful. As he got closer, Eddie's breath hitched. It felt like a moment frozen in time. This man, this larger-than-life figure, stepping into the very space Eddie had been left to occupy in silence for so long. Stallone's eyes met Eddie's, and in that brief, quiet exchange, something passed between them. Eddie could feel it, a recognition, an understanding that went beyond the surface. It wasn't the usual pity or disgust Eddie had grown accustomed to from passersby. There was no judgment, just an acknowledgement. The moment was fleeting, but it carried more weight than anything Eddie had felt in years. It was as if, for the first time in a long while, someone saw him, truly saw him. The tension in the streets was palpable, as if the world itself had taken a collective breath, holding it in anticipation of what would come next. Eddie could feel the undercurrent of unease rising around him, swirling like a storm just out of sight. It wasn't just the remnants of the disrespect he had endured moments before. It was something deeper, something shifting beneath the surface. People moved faster now, their steps more deliberate, their eyes avoiding contact. Even the usual sounds of the city, the honking cars, the hum of voices, seemed to fade, replaced by a tense quiet that made Eddie's chest tighten. Stallone, however, moved with a steady calm, his eyes never leaving Eddie's for too long. The actor's presence was magnetic, like a force that pulled people into his orbit without them even realizing it. He was not part of the crowd, not lost in the noise of the city. He stood out, unmistakable, But it wasn't his fame that drew attention. It was the way he carried himself, with a quiet strength that seemed to demand respect. And as he stepped closer to Eddie, the world around them seemed to slow even further. A ripple of whispers spread through the crowd, people catching sight of Stallone's approach. Phones began to raise, some trying to capture a moment that felt as though it were too significant to ignore. The earlier noise of laughter, of chatter, died down, replaced by the low hum of cameras clicking, the quiet shuffle of feet. Everyone knew something was happening, but no one knew what it would lead to. Eddie remained seated, still processing the unexpectedness of it all. Stallone stopped just in front of him, his posture open but unhurried. His gaze didn't shift to the people who were now watching, waiting. He didn't acknowledge the crowd's growing excitement or the anticipation building in the air. His focus remained solely on Eddie, as if there was no one else in the world. The tension between them was thick, but it wasn't threatening. It was the kind of silence that demanded to be filled, the kind of silence that made everyone around them hold their breath, wondering what would happen next. The crowd shifted uncomfortably as the man in the tailored suit, oblivious to the growing tension, continued his path down the street. He was still riding high on his moment of cruelty, unaware of the way the world around him had begun to change. People's eyes were no longer on him in admiration, but with disbelief. His casual disregard for Eddie, the homeless veteran, had rattled something deep within the onlookers. But the man didn't notice. He walked on with his shoulders back, chin up, eyes forward. His world, insulated from the realities around him, remained unchanged. That is, until he saw Stalone. The actor's presence was unmistakable, and suddenly, the man's eyes widened with recognition. He stopped in his tracks, his smug grin widening at the sight. It wasn't often that the world's most famous action hero stood within reach, and the man, already feeling victorious, couldn't help but seize the opportunity. With a laugh, he sauntered towards Stalone, grabbing the mic he had discarded earlier. Well, he called out, his voice dripping with mockery. If it isn't Mr. Tough Guy himself. What? You just come down here to watch the real fight? Or are you here to throw a few punches like in the movies? His words were calculated, meant to draw attention, to incite. He moved closer to Eddie, standing tall over him, the mic now aimed at Stalone. What? You gonna stand there and do nothing while this man begs for a quarter? He sneered, nodding toward Eddie's outstretched hand. You don't even belong here. Eddie didn't flinch, but he felt the venom in every word. The man's voice was a blade, cutting through the fragile silence that had settled over the crowd. The taunts, the insults, were nothing new to Eddie. But hearing it in front of Stalone, a man who had made his career by standing against the very kind of arrogance the man now wore like a crown, it stung in a way that was different. The crowd's energy shifted again, but this time there was a weight to the tension, a spark in the air, as if everyone knew that someone was about to challenge the man who thought himself untouchable. The air hung thick with unspoken words, the kind that linger long after an insult has been thrown. The man in the suit, his smirk widening as he taunted Eddie and Stalone, basked in the attention he thought he commanded. He was reveling in the power of the moment, unaware of the ripple he had just created. But Stalone, standing still and silent, wasn't playing into the game. He was waiting for the right moment to shift the balance. Eddie sat frozen, his hands clenched tightly in his lap, his breathing slow and controlled. The storm of emotions inside him was a quiet one, but it burned just beneath the surface. He could feel the shift in the crowd around him. The earlier buzz had died down, replaced by a thick, uncomfortable silence. The people who had once avoided his gaze now watched the unfolding scene, their attention no longer on the arrogant man in the suit, but on the veteran who had been wronged, and the man who had seen it. The man in the suit, oblivious to the tension building around him, continued to circle, his voice rising in volume, demanding attention. What are you waiting for, Stalone? He taunted, his grin growing as the crowd shifted nervously. You here to take the spotlight, or just watch? This is real life, not some movie set. But Stalone didn't flinch. His eyes were steady, never leaving the man, never breaking the silent connection that now existed between them. The more the man ranted, the more the crowd began to shrink back from him. The realization was starting to settle in, that this wasn't about an actor and a loudmouth. This was something deeper. This was about respect, dignity, and the way we see those we often overlook. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. The people around them seemed to hold their breath, the weight of the silence pushing down on the man in the suit, and Eddie, still sitting in the shadow of it all, felt the storm rise inside him. He had been invisible for too long. But now, for the first time, he wasn't alone. The world was watching, and someone was finally standing up for him. The tension in the street was palpable, like the calm before a storm. Stallone remained motionless, his quiet presence slowly growing into something undeniable. The man in the suit, full of bravado, was growing bolder, his insults becoming louder, more desperate for a reaction. He didn't understand that the crowd's focus was shifting, not to him, but to the man who had said nothing, who had yet to speak a word. Stallone's gaze remained fixed, not on the man, but on Eddie. He saw the veteran's silent suffering, the weight of the years, the way Eddie carried it all with dignity despite everything. It wasn't about being a hero in this moment. It wasn't about stepping in to fight for glory. It was about something far more important, showing Eddie that he had not been forgotten. Then, without warning, Stallone moved. His first step was slow, deliberate. The sound of his shoes hitting the pavement was muffled by the shifting energy in the air. People instinctively made way, not because they were asked to, but because they recognized something in him, something that made the space around him open up. It wasn't his fame, not the way his face graced billboards or silver screens, but the way he carried himself, grounded, unwavering. He didn't need to say anything. He was already commanding respect, simply by being. As he walked toward the man in the suit, the crowd's murmurs grew quieter, more expectant. The man didn't see it at first, still riding high on his cruel words. He didn't see the way Stallone's eyes hardened with purpose as he closed the distance between them. Finally, Stallone stopped just a few feet away from the man. The suit's grin faltered as he took in Stallone's presence, feeling the weight of it press down on him. There was no boastful speech, no dramatic flourish. Just a man, standing firm, his eyes unwavering, the silence speaking louder than anything else. For the first time, the man in the suit felt the weight of his arrogance. The air was thick with expectation, and in that moment, the world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for what Stallone would do next. The man in the tailored suit didn't understand. He didn't realize who he was dealing with, didn't comprehend the quiet power standing before him. He had spent his life surrounded by people who flattered him, who deferred to his wealth and status. He was used to being the center of attention, used to being the one who controlled the room. He had never faced someone who didn't care about his money, his influence, or his noise. Stallone stood there, still as stone, his eyes fixed on a man with the same unwavering calm that had made him a legend. But the man didn't get it. He thought this was just another moment for him to flex, another chance to be the loudest voice in the room. He didn't realize that Stallone's silence wasn't weakness. It was the absence of arrogance, the calm that comes from knowing who you are and not needing to prove it to anyone. "Come on," the man sneered, taking a step closer, his grin widening. "You don't scare me. You're just an actor. You want to make a name for yourself? Come on, show us what you've got. I'm real. You're not." The words hung in the air, but they didn't faze Stallone. He wasn't there to prove anything to anyone. He wasn't there for a fight or to entertain the crowd. He had seen men like this before, men who thought the world owed them something, men who threw their weight around because they thought it would make them bigger, better. But Stallone was different. The quiet confidence in him was the kind that comes from years of hard work, dedication, and an understanding of true strength. He wasn't there to yell or to taunt. His power came from his stillness, his ability to stand tall in the face of someone who didn't even know who they were facing. The crowd began to stir, sensing the shift. The man in the suit was getting nervous, and the more he pushed, the more Stallone's calm presence magnified. In that moment, it became clear the man wasn't facing a celebrity, a fighter in a movie. He He was facing something far more powerful, a man who had seen it all, who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. And the man in the suit was starting to realize just how wrong he was. The man in the suit could feel the shift in the air, the weight of Stallone's presence settling over him like a heavy cloak. For the first time, the bravado he had worn so easily began to feel like a burden. He took a step back, uncertain, his confidence faltering under the steady gaze that never wavered. The crowd had quieted now, all eyes on the two men, the tension palpable. The noise that had once surrounded them was gone, replaced by a suffocating silence that seemed to amplify every breath, every movement. Stallone's expression remained unreadable, his posture calm and relaxed, as if he had all the time in the world. He didn't need to speak, didn't need to do anything to prove himself. The strength that radiated from him wasn't in his words or his gestures. It was in his stillness, in the way he stood unflinching before the man who had dared to mock a homeless veteran. The man's smirk faltered, and for the first time, he realized he had miscalculated. "I don't think you understand who you're talking to," Stallone said quietly, his voice steady but carrying a weight that made the man freeze in his tracks. "You think you could just walk through life with no regard for anyone else, but that doesn't make you strong. It makes you weak, and it makes you a coward." The words hit harder than any punch could. The man's chest tightened, his jaw clenched, but he said nothing. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in front of so many people. He tried to find his voice, but it faltered. What could he say? How could he defend himself when the truth was staring him in the face? Stallone stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "You think power comes from tearing others down. But real strength, the kind that matters, is built by lifting people up, by showing respect where it's due. And you just disrespected a man who earned his place in this world." The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. The man's arrogance had crumbled in the face of Stallone's quiet resolve. And in that moment, something inside him shifted, something that couldn't be ignored. The silence that had held the crowd in a tight grip was finally broken, not by the roar of an angry response or a loud confrontation, but by a simple shift in the atmosphere. The man in the suit, his pride wounded, took a step back, his arrogance evaporating like smoke. He looked around, as if searching for something, anything to hold on to, but the crowd's eyes were on him now, not with admiration, but with judgment. For the first time in his life, the spotlight felt like a weight he couldn't carry. Stallone's gaze never left him, steady and unflinching. There was no need for theatrics, no need for grand gestures. His presence alone was enough to dismantle the bravado the man had clung to. He had been a bully, a man who used words to hurt, to belittle. But now, in the face of real strength, he found himself small. The people around them watched in a tense stillness, the energy in the air thick with anticipation. The man in the suit opened his mouth, but no words came out at first. His mouth moved, his tongue trying to form something, but his confidence had been shattered, his voice no longer carrying the venom it once had. Stallone finally broke the silence, his voice calm but filled with quiet authority. "You don't get to walk away from this," he said, his words cutting through the stillness. "You think your words don't matter? That you can hurt someone just because they're down? No, you've got a lot to learn." The crowd, which had once been divided, now stood united in the uncomfortable truth. No one had spoken up when the man spat on Eddie, but Stallone's intervention had done what they hadn't been able to. It had broken through the layers of indifference, revealing the raw reality of the situation. The man in the suit swallowed hard, his throat dry. He glanced down at Eddie, the veteran still sitting silently, the weight of his past silently holding him up in this moment. Eddie hadn't needed to say a word. Stallone had said everything that needed to be said. The crowd waited, breath held, as the realization slowly settled in. The man had been confronted, but it was more than that. He had been changed. The man in the suit stood there, his mouth agape, trying to process the gravity of what had just happened. His mind raced, but there were no words, no excuses to fall back on. The audience, once divided in their admiration for him, now turned their backs. The smugness he had once carried with ease was gone. replaced by something he couldn't hide: shame. The ripple of his actions had reached farther than he could have ever imagined, and the consequences were settling in, heavy and undeniable. Stallone didn't give him time to recover. He wasn't there to offer the man any comfort, any way to save face. "You don't get to walk away from this," Stallone repeated, his voice unwavering. "You've made your choice. You've disrespected someone who deserves far more than you've given him." The crowd was silent, holding its breath as the words landed. The man's arrogance had been a shield, a way to protect himself from the vulnerability he feared. But now that shield had been shattered, Eddie's quiet dignity, the way he had sat there, unmoved and unbroken by the insult, had been the true strength all along. The suit had underestimated that. He had thought power was in the flashy words, the bravado, the ability to tear others down. But Stallone, through his quiet intervention, had proven just how wrong he was. The crowd's gaze now shifted to the man in the suit, the murmurs beginning to rise. The people who had once been charmed by his charisma were now growing uncomfortable with his actions. They had seen something they couldn't unsee: the cruelty of someone who had let power go to his head, who had used it to belittle others, to make himself feel important. And just like that, the man was no longer the center of attention. The arena, the people, the moment itself had moved on from him. His actions had cost him far more than just respect. They had cost him the very thing he had held most dear: his reputation. The consequences of his actions were now unfolding in real time, and there was no turning back. The man in the suit had been given a moment of reckoning, but Eddie had been waiting for years for something far more meaningful. As the crowd's eyes slowly shifted away from the spectacle of the arrogant man, they turned back to Eddie, the silent figure who had endured it all. Stallone's presence had shifted the energy, but it was Eddie who had quietly commanded it. For the first time, people were beginning to look at him, not as the homeless veteran begging for change, but as someone who deserved to be seen, heard, and respected. Stallone, sensing the shift, took a step back, giving Eddie the space he needed. It wasn't just about the confrontation anymore. It was about the story that no one knew, the story of a man who had given more than most could imagine. The words Stallone had spoken were a spark, but Eddie's silence had always been the fuel. He had lived a lifetime of battles, both on and off the field, and the truth of who he was had been hidden in plain sight. Slowly, Eddie stood, his body creaking with the weight of years spent on the streets. He didn't need to say anything right away, but the silence between him and the crowd spoke volumes. People were waiting, not out of pity, but with genuine curiosity. They wanted to know who he really was. Eddie's gaze softened as he looked around. He wasn't sure where to start, but for the first time in a long while, the words felt like they could finally come. "I was once like all of you," he began, his voice low, yet steady. "I fought. I bled for this country, just like so many others. I was a soldier, one of the many who came home only to be forgotten." The crowd stilled, leaning in, drawn into his quiet story. Eddie's eyes flickered with memories of a time when he had been part of something bigger. He wasn't just the man they saw now. He had been a hero once, and though the world had moved on from that, the truth of his sacrifices remained. For the first time, the people saw him for what he truly was, a hero who had been lost in the noise, but was now ready to be found. The air in the street felt electric, charged with something more than just the heat of the day. As Eddie spoke, his words sank in slowly, like a stone dropped into water, sending ripples through the crowd. At first, there was only silence, a tense, pregnant pause as his revelation settled. The people who had walked by him without a second glance, who had avoided his gaze, who had turned their faces away, now stood frozen, their eyes wide, their mouths slightly open. They had assumed things about him, things that had been wrong from the start. And now, with each word Eddie spoke, their assumptions crumbled. The man in the suit, still standing near Stalone, seemed to shrink under the weight of the crowd's shifting focus. His eyes darted from Eddie to Stalone, then back to Eddie, as if the revelation had somehow made him feel smaller. The same crowd that had once admired him now looked at him with growing discomfort, as if they too had been complicit in the injustice. Eddie's voice, steady and quiet, carried a weight that made the world around them seem to hold its breath. "I didn't ask for this life," he continued, his hands slowly unfolding, palms facing the crowd. "I didn't ask to be left behind, but it happened. And now I'm just here waiting for someone to see me, like they see you, like they see themselves." The crowd shifted again, some people glancing at each other, others just standing there, taking in the truth of his words. They weren't just looking at the homeless veteran anymore. They were looking at a man who had given everything for something bigger than himself. There were no cheers, no applause, just the weight of realization. They hadn't known. They hadn't understood. But now, with Eddie's backstory unveiled, the crowd couldn't help but feel the depth of what had been lost in all the noise, in all the forgotten faces. The silence between Eddie and the crowd hung heavy, not as an uncomfortable pause, but as a moment of collective understanding. They weren't just shocked by Eddie's past. They were shocked by their own blindness to it. The truth about Eddie wasn't just in his words. It was in the scars that marked him, the ones that no one could see. He wasn't just a homeless veteran. He wasn't just a man who had fallen through the cracks of a society that had moved on without him. The truth was buried in the years he had spent in service, in the countless battles he had fought that had never made the headlines, that had never earned him a medal or a moment of recognition. Eddie's gaze swept across the crowd, meeting the eyes of those who had once passed him by. They had looked at him with pity, with discomfort, even with disdain. They had assumed he was just another failure, just another lost soul on the streets. But he was more than that. He had been more than that. "I didn't ask for the war," Eddie said, his voice softer now, but still firm. "I didn't ask to give everything I had, but that's what we did. That's what we were trained to do, to protect, to fight, to give. And when we came home, we didn't get a hero's welcome. We didn't get a parade. We were forgotten." The crowd stood in stunned silence, absorbing the weight of his words. Some people shifted uncomfortably, the guilt of their previous assumptions settling in. They had never taken the time to ask, never looked beneath the surface to understand. To them, Eddie had been a nameless figure on the corner, nothing more than a body to ignore or avoid. But now they saw him. They saw the man who had once fought for their freedoms, who had once been a symbol of the strength and courage they admired in others. He had paid a price they hadn't understood, a price that had cost him not just his physical well-being, but his place in the world. Eddie's eyes lingered on Stalone, who stood beside him, quiet and still. The actor's unwavering support spoke volumes. This wasn't just about one man's suffering. It was about the countless others who had been forgotten, whose sacrifices had been erased from memory. The truth was, Eddie wasn't the only one. There were others like him, heroes whose stories had never been told, whose sacrifices had been buried. And now, for the first time, Eddie's voice was being heard. The stark contrast between Eddie's past and the world around him felt like a violent jolt, a clash of realities that echoed through the street, rattling those who witnessed it. Eddie had spoken of his service, of the silent sacrifices he had made, and the truth hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Yet, as he stood there, side by side with Stalone, the crowd's gaze shifted between the two men. On one side, a Hollywood legend, larger than life, a figure of action and triumph. On the other, a homeless veteran, forgotten by many, his past buried beneath the weight of years spent on the streets. The man in the suit, still shaken by the unfolding turn of events, stood off to the side, realizing that his world, a world built on power, wealth, and appearance, was crumbling. Eddie's truth had shattered it in a way no insult or taunt could have. The arrogance he had once carried with such confidence now felt fragile, inconsequential. And as he looked at Eddie, really looked at him for the first time, he saw a man who had lived a reality so far removed from his own that it was impossible to ignore. The crowd's murmur grew louder, some questioning how they had failed to see it, others lost in thought as they tried to reconcile what they had just learned. Stallone stood quietly, his presence acting as a steady anchor amidst the whirlwind of realizations. He wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. Not today. Today, he was simply a man who knew that sometimes The true heroes don't wear capes or make headlines. They sit quietly, unnoticed, bearing the weight of the world without a word of complaint. As Eddie met Stallone's gaze, there was a silent understanding between them. They were both men who had known struggle, who had faced battles, one on the front lines, the other on the silver screen. But in this moment, their worlds collided. And for the first time, Eddie wasn't just a forgotten soldier on the streets. He was a man who had been seen, who had been heard. The clash of realities wasn't just a matter of different worlds. It was a reminder that we all walk through life with our own struggles, our own stories, waiting to be acknowledged. Sylvester Stallone didn't need to say much. His presence alone was enough to shift the balance in the moment. The crowd, once lost in their own thoughts and distractions, now focused on him with an intensity that spoke volumes. It wasn't the typical fanfare one might expect from a celebrity. It was quieter, more powerful. Stallone stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Eddie, and then on the man in the suit, who was now visibly shrinking under the weight of his own actions. The arrogance that had once clung to the man in the suit now seemed to melt away, replaced by a nervous energy. He hadn't anticipated this. He hadn't expected Stallone, this larger-than-life figure, to step in. He had thought that his words, his power, would go unchallenged. But Stallone, in his calm, unflinching way, had made it clear that some things weren't for the taking. Stallone stopped just in front of Eddie, placing a hand on his shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but to Eddie, it meant more than words could convey. It wasn't just support, it was a sign of solidarity, a symbol that he wasn't alone. The crowd, still reeling from the realization of what had just happened, now watched as Stallone turned his full attention to the arrogant man. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Stallone's voice was steady, but there was a weight to it that made the words cut through the air. "You think you can just walk around and treat people like this because you feel untouchable?" He shook his head, a small, disappointed frown crossing his features. The man in the suit opened his mouth, but no words came out. He couldn't form an answer. He couldn't fight back against the truth that was now staring him in the face. Stallone's eyes never left him, unblinking, unwavering. There's strength in silence, in showing respect where it's due. Stallone continued, his words slow, deliberate. "But what you did, it wasn't strength. It was weakness. And it's time you learned what that really means." For the first time in a long while, the man in the suit realized the truth. Some battles couldn't be won with power or words, only with respect. The moment hung in the air, thick with tension and uncertainty. The man in the suit stood frozen, his once confident stance now a shadow of what it had been moments before. His jaw tightened, his eyes darting around as though searching for an escape, a way to reclaim the authority he had so carelessly wielded. But the crowd had already shifted, their eyes no longer on him in admiration, but in judgment. The realization of his mistake was crashing down on him, and there was no running from it. Stallone stood firm, his quiet presence unshaken. He had stepped in, not to humiliate, but to teach. The silence between him and the arrogant man was deafening, but the lesson was clear. Strength wasn't in the loudest voice or the most expensive suit. It wasn't in tearing others down to lift yourself up. True strength was in humility, in respect for those who had endured far more than you ever could. The man, his shoulders slumped in defeat, looked around at the faces now watching him. The crowd's once silent disapproval had grown into a collective understanding. No one was cheering for his downfall, but everyone recognized the weight of what had just happened. For the first time, the man began to understand the power of humility, the power of being wrong, of being shown the harsh truth, and realizing the impact of his own actions. He swallowed hard, his chest tight with the sudden realization that his bravado had led him to this point. It was as if a door had opened in his mind, and he saw the world through a different lens, one of consequence, of empathy, of humanity. He glanced at Eddie, the veteran who had been his target, and for the first time truly saw him, not as an obstacle, not as a beggar, but as a man who had paid a price. And then, as if it was the only thing left to do, the man did something he hadn't expected. He took a step forward towards Eddie. His voice was quiet but sincere when he spoke, the arrogance gone from his tone. "I'm sorry," he said, his words rough but real. Eddie looked up, their eyes meeting, and for the first time, he didn't feel like a forgotten figure on the corner. He saw the man for what he was now, a man who, against all odds, had found his redemption in the face of his own shame. The apology hung in the air, suspended between them, as Eddie stood in quiet contemplation. The man's words were not expected, and for a moment, Eddie didn't know how to respond. He had grown used to the cold silence of the streets, to the dismissive looks and the quick steps that avoided his gaze. An apology, especially one that felt genuine, was something he hadn't anticipated. The weight of it was heavier than the man could have known. For a moment, Eddie's mind flashed back to his time in the military. The countless faces he had seen, the names he had fought beside, each one etched into his memory forever. The names of soldiers who had given everything, just as he had. Men and women who never had the chance to come back home, who never had their names recognized. He had carried their stories, their sacrifices, the weight of those names on his shoulders for years. The man standing before him, once so full of pride and cruelty, now seemed like a shadow of that arrogance. The power he had once held in his name was gone, replaced by something Eddie had long learned to value: humility. "Your name means something now," Eddie said, his voice low but steady. The words were heavy, not just for the man in front of him, but for Eddie himself. He had never asked for recognition, never needed anyone to know his name. But now, standing here with this man, in front of Stallone, in front of the crowd, Eddie realized that there was more to a name than he had ever understood. A name wasn't just a label. It was a testament to what someone had endured, to what they had lived through, and how they carried that through the world. The man had apologized, yes, but Eddie knew the real weight of redemption wasn't in the words. It was in the actions that followed. "Don't forget who you are," Eddie said, his eyes locking with the man's. "Don't forget what you've done. The weight of your name is yours to carry now. Make it count." The crowd stood still, watching, waiting as the silence stretched. And in that moment, both men understood something. The weight of a name wasn't something that could be easily shed or forgotten. It was a burden, but also a chance for redemption, for growth. The man in the suit had just begun to learn what that truly meant. The apology hung in the air like a fragile thing, offered with sincerity, but Eddie knew it couldn't undo the damage. Words were powerful, yes, but they were fleeting. What had been done, what had been said, was already etched into the fabric of the moment, and no apology could erase it. Eddie could see the man's struggle, the way his hands trembled as he spoke, the genuine regret in his eyes. But he also saw the truth. An apology was a start, but it was only the beginning. The scars left by cruelty ran deeper than words could heal. The crowd had begun to disperse, but the weight of the moment remained. People still lingered, their eyes darting between Eddie and the man, unsure of what to do with this new development. They had seen a man break down the wall of arrogance, only to realize it wasn't enough to just ask for forgiveness. The damage had already been done. Eddie had been publicly humiliated, treated like nothing more than a discarded piece of society. And that wound didn't vanish with a few simple words. Eddie looked at the man, his expression unreadable. He wasn't angry. There was no fury in his gaze. But there was something else, a quiet understanding that some things could never be taken back. The moment when the man had spit near his feet, the humiliation, the disregard, it couldn't be erased by the apology. Eddie had lived through worse. He had fought battles on foreign soil, had seen comrades fall, and had buried pieces of himself that he knew he'd never get back. The man had asked for forgiveness, but forgiveness didn't mean the slate was wiped clean. The truth of what had happened was now out there, and Eddie knew that for some, the scars would remain, even if the apology was sincere. "Apologies aren't enough," Eddie said, his voice low but steady. "You can't just fix things by saying sorry. It takes more than that. It takes action. It takes a change." The man nodded, his face falling. He knew. The crowd knew. And Eddie, more than anyone, understood the hard truth. Words could try to undo the damage, but only actions could make it right. The crowd, once divided, had begun to shift. The murmurs that filled the air were no longer whispers of discomfort or idle chatter. They were conversations born of realization. At first, they had seen Eddie as just another man on the streets, a nameless figure to ignore. They had viewed the man in the suit with admiration for his wealth, his confidence, his apparent power. But now all that had changed. The shift had been subtle at first. Glances exchanged, eyebrows raised, but the transformation was undeniable. The same people who had looked past Eddie before were now seeing him for the man he truly was. Some still looked at the man in the suit with uncertainty, unsure of how to process his apology. But even more were looking at Eddie now, not with pity, but with respect. They were starting to understand that the lines between right and wrong weren't as clear-cut as they had once thought. It wasn't about wealth or status. It wasn't about what you wore or how loudly you spoke. It was about the actions that defined you, about the way you treated others, especially when you thought no one was looking. The hum of the crowd had shifted from awkward tension to something more reflective. People weren't just going through the motions anymore. They were questioning their own assumptions, their own roles in what had happened. A few started to approach Eddie, cautiously at first, but then with genuine warmth. A woman in the front row, who had once avoided making eye contact with him, now stepped forward with a small smile, offering him a bottle of water. A young man, perhaps no older than 20, came up next, his hand extended. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. For the first time in what felt like forever, Eddie looked up and met their gazes. There was no shame in his eyes, only gratitude. The apology from the man in the suit had started the change, but it was the crowd, the people who had witnessed it, that had made it real. Eddie wasn't invisible anymore. He wasn't just the forgotten veteran on the corner. He was a man with a past, with a story, and with the respect of those around him. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. And for the first time in a long while, Eddie felt like he was truly seen. Eddie stood quietly as the crowd began to disperse, their voices now carrying a different tone, one of respect, one of recognition. They had seen something in him today, something they hadn't noticed before. It wasn't the tattered clothes or the weathered face. It wasn't the crumpled sign asking for change. It was the quiet strength that had held him steady through years of struggle, the kind of strength that didn't need to be shouted from the rooftops. It was the resilience of a man who had fought for his country and for his dignity, even when the world had turned its back on him. As the last of the onlookers slowly filed away, Eddie remained on the corner, his eyes watching the empty street. The noise of the crowd had faded, but the quiet stillness of the moment lingered. He wasn't sure if the change in how people saw him would last, but for the first time, he felt it didn't matter. The change had already happened within him. Stalone, who had stood by him through the ordeal, now approached. His presence was comforting, yet unassuming, as if he understood without speaking the weight of the moment. He didn't offer a word of praise or encouragement, but the silence between them spoke volumes. Eddie looked up at Stalone, his face reflecting a calm that hadn't been there before. "I didn't need anyone to tell me I was a hero," he said quietly, his voice steady. "I know what I've done. I know who I am." Stalone nodded, his expression softening. He understood. Eddie wasn't looking for validation from the crowd or anyone else. He had already earned his strength long ago, on the front lines, in the quiet moments when no one was watching. It was the kind of strength that wasn't loud, that didn't demand attention, but that was always there when it counted. The world might not have always seen Eddie for who he was, but today, in the stillness of the street, he knew he had nothing left to prove. His strength had been earned, not through words, but through years of quietly surviving when the world had forgotten him. And that, he realized, was the greatest victory of all. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the city, Eddie remained standing on the corner, his body weary, but his spirit steadied. The crowd had long since scattered, but the weight of the day's events lingered. People had seen him for who he truly was, not just the homeless man on the corner, not just the veteran forgotten by society, but a person, someone who had sacrificed, who had given, and who had persevered in the face of all odds. The man in the suit, once so full of arrogance, had disappeared into the distance, his earlier bravado replaced by the quiet realization that the world wasn't as simple as he had thought. He had apologized, but it was clear to everyone involved that his words couldn't undo the damage done. What mattered now was the change that came after, the actions, the humility, the willingness to learn from the mistakes. And in the midst of it all, Eddie stood as a silent witness to the lesson unfolding. The lesson wasn't just for the man who had wronged him. It was for everyone. It was a lesson in humility and honor, in recognizing that true strength wasn't measured by wealth or power, but by the ability to admit when you were wrong and to change. It was a lesson that came not from grand speeches or heroic deeds, but from the quiet resilience of a man who had never given up, despite being overlooked and discarded by the world. Stallone stood beside him, a silent presence who had stepped in not as a celebrity, but as a man who understood the weight of Eddie's story. He had shown the crowd that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stand still, not with your fists raised, but with your heart open. As the last of the daylight faded, Eddie turned to Stalone, offering a small nod of gratitude. He didn't need any applause, any recognition. The lesson had been learned, not through words, but through the quiet, steadfast strength that had been there all along. And as he stood there, finally seen, he knew that true honor was found in the silence, the kind that spoke louder than any boastful declaration ever could.